And I'm fucking livid that we are stuck in the timeline where Alex Jones is right. Kind of worse instead of worse.
Oh no! Oh, no. Okay, no.
Why aren't the Amish afraid of COVID? Because they don't have TVs.
As I said, democracy is a system that reinforces authoritarian ideals.
I hope I don't get canceled. Talk to Steve.
Being a victim of a tragedy doesn't make you an expert in public policy.
Well, I mean, AOC is a drama queen and she's full of shit.
Remember, they lost the Afghan war 10 years ago.
You brought a freaking guillotine.
They said, you don't get to tell us no, we're the state health department, and I said, hell no.
It wasn't making Christianity better, it was making rock worse.
What the fuck do you have on your face, Olivia?
You want to make the world a better place? Have some babies and raise them to not be stupid.
I remember thinking, man, governments are not going to like this shit.
Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, activists, anarchists, and people of the internet, thank you for tuning into another episode of O'Donnell for Liberty. As always, I'm your host, Justin. And before we get started, just remember, whatever platform you listen to, whether YouTube Live, Odyssey, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Anchor, or on the air at LRN.FM, you can help grow the show by liking, commenting, subscribing, and sharing with your friends. And if you enjoy the content, you can join our production team by visiting patreon.com/O'Donnell for Liberty. Again, that's patreon.com/O'Donnell. The number 4 Liberty. If you want to keep in touch between shows, follow me on social media and join our community Discord channel where you can chat with other fans of the show at any time. All these links can be found in the description of the video or podcast that you're listening to, as well as on o'donnellforliberty.com. So check the description for that link and make sure you give it a visit today. Today, we have a very special guest, former British diplomat and journalist, founder of the Independent Diplomat, author of 2 books, Independent Diplomat, Dispatches from an Unaccountable Elite, and The Leaderless Revolution, How Ordinary People Will Take Power and Change Politics in the 21st Century, as well as the subject of a 2020 documentary, Accidental Anarchist. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the show, Carne Ross. Carne, thanks for joining today. How are you?
I'm great, thanks. Thanks for having me.
So, I guess where to start, I mean, my own path to anarchism, my own path to identifying as an anarchist and where I've come, I also started out as kind of a statist, as we like to call them, people who believed in the state, advocated for the state, worked for the state. I went the military background. I was in the U.S. Army and rose to the ranks in the U.S. Army and worked for the federal government with the Federal Emergency Management Agency. My degree in academic background is in emergency management and homeland security. And then it was the culmination of my experiences within that apparatus, within the bureaucracy of the state, within the military-industrial complex that finally led me to the conclusion, like, oh, we're the bad guys. This isn't working. We need to try something different. You got your start in like the bowels of bureaucracy, the international bureaucracy. You were a diplomat. Mm-hmm. What drove you to work for the British Foreign Services, and like what was your motivation going in there and your mindset when you decided you wanted to be a diplomat and change the world through the political process?
I was just really fascinated by international affairs from a really quite young age. I read the newspaper in the days when we had paper newspapers, you know, cover to cover. I was fascinated by the Cold War, by deterrence theory, by nuclear weapons, the Falklands War, which I lived through as a boy. You know, I was just really intrigued by it. And also, there was in our family a real respect for the Foreign Office as an elite profession. Both my parents and my sister had tried to join the Foreign Office and had failed. And I was regarded really as the stupid one of the family. And I applied to join the Foreign Office, and against everybody's expectations, I got into the far stream, which is the kind of elite bit of the Foreign Office, where you can basically expect to be promoted to ambassador fairly quickly. So that's how I got into it, and I loved it. It was very interesting.
And like you fast-tracked, you were at the forefront of British services at a time where the world was kind of falling apart from a diplomatic relations standpoint in 2003, and you ended up in the heart of everything that was going wrong with the Iraq War.
Yeah, from 1998 to 2002, in fact, I was posted to the UK mission to the UN, which was like the cockpit of our Iraq policy, because it was where sanctions against Iraq were agreed and enforced, and also weapons inspections on Iraq's weapons of mass destruction. So it was really the heart of the case for war that was eventually made, and I worked on that subject very closely for 4.5 years, up until about 6 months before the war took place. So I wasn't working on it when the war took place, but I was very much aware of it because I was still in New York City. I was actually on sabbatical at the time. So I watched it happen from a very close vantage point.
And I've seen things you've said, like you were very involved in the weapons inspection program after that, and it's become almost common knowledge nowadays that the American populace, the British populace, all of NATO's demographics were lied to about the presence of weapons of mass destruction and Iraqi involvement in terrorist action to justify that war. And you ended up like in the thick of it. Like, at what point did you realize, at what point did it become known to you that it was a lie and things were being manipulated behind the scenes to perpetuate that war?
Well, it started pretty soon after 9/11, which I lived through in New York City. We started to exaggerate the case that Iraq was a threat from that point forward. And I was aware of intelligence briefings that were being prepared inside the government, which were very much contrary to the line that we had been taking as diplomats for a long time, which was that Iraq was not a threat, that it had been successfully contained by weapons inspections, and that we did not think it had substantial stocks of weapons of mass destruction. And that line started to change after 9/11. I remember writing letters to my authorities in London saying, why are we saying this? Because this is different from what we've been saying for a long time. I mean, you don't have to be an expert on weapons of mass destruction to see the message from the government, both the US and UK governments, very much change over a period of time before and after 9/11. So I saw that propaganda case begin to be made. And then as the war approached and the governments concerned strengthened the case in public, I was very conscious that what they were doing was completely inconsistent with what I knew to be the case about Iraq's weapons of mass destruction. I was talking to the weapons inspectors, and they were saying nothing new has been found. So I was questioning it. Why on earth are we saying all of this? I knew it to be false.
And at what point was it like finally so bad, so false that you decided to walk away?
Well, I wish I'd walked away at the time in 2003. In the end, I didn't resign until 2004, when I was invited to testify to the first official inquiry into the use of intelligence on the Iraq war. I testified in secret to that inquiry. I was still a British diplomat at the time. And when I testified, I felt that the testimony I gave, which was, of course, very critical of the government and said the government had basically exaggerated the case for war and had ignored alternatives to war, I felt that I couldn't give that testimony and remain as a British diplomat. So that was the point at which I decided to resign.
And at that point, was that when you started researching alternatives to government? I mean, from there, how did your path get from British diplomat, seeing the troubles in government, being on the inside, watching the government lie to people and perpetuate a war that cost millions of lives and trillions of dollars, to no government, anarchy is the solution?
Yeah, it's a hell of a trip. Yeah. Well, to cut a long story short, I think having been in government, watching government lie over a war was a very disillusioning experience. I had believed that governments were basically honest, were run by basically decent people, trying to do the right thing. And to watch my colleagues who I liked, and thought were decent people, go along with this travesty was really, really shocking to me. It was a really profound shock. And as I said, I was on sabbatical when the war actually started, and I was reading about government and about policy making and trying to work out why government was getting it so wrong, not just in war, but also in other things like, the gross inequality of our society, what was happening to the environment, the concentration of carbon in the atmosphere was just going up and up. And I just felt government was failing in this fundamental way. And I began to ask what would be a better system. And, it was mostly done through reading, actually. I just read in New York University's library and just talked to people, and eventually came to some conclusions about what would be a better system, namely people making decisions for themselves, and realized, somewhat to my surprise, that this was anarchism.
Yeah, and I like to tell people all the time, like whenever I get pushback from people, it's like, oh, you're an anarchist, you just want chaos in the streets. And it's like, no, anarchy doesn't mean no rules. It just means no rulers. It respects the individual sovereignty and individual decision-making process.
Quite right.
Now, you talked about the environment, and you do still talk a lot about the environment and environmental policy and climate change and what can be done. To me, that is kind of the disconnect in what I see in what separates you from the anarchists I'm familiar with and the environmentalists I'm familiar with here in the US. Whereas like a lot of the anarchists will support things like nuclear power and decentralization and deregulation, and don't really care about climate change, so to speak. They just want government out of things and to allow people and localized microgrids to make decision making on how they fuel themselves. And those who really care about the environment, like you do, and environmental protection, are constantly lobbying for more government intervention and for the government to fix the problem. How do you approach it?
I'm not. I don't see
government
approach that. Particularly the answer.
How do you approach an environmentalist perspective with a non-governmental solution?
Well, to pick up on something you said, I mean, the kind of energy system I would like is a highly decentralized energy system. Renewable energy is much easier to decentralize than coal or gas or nuclear, which implies big, steaming plants of energy and the distribution of power to lots and lots of people, whereas renewables can be located all over the country and can lead to a much greater localization of energy production. So I think that's one of the ways that I would like to see the energy system evolve in both a more renewable direction, but also a more communal direction, where the means of energy are commonly governed and owned by people locally. So I don't see caring about the environment and caring about climate change as being at all inconsistent. But I should also add that, I work on the environment as my day job now, and I'm also a realist. I mean, I work with the system as it is, and I would like it to be a decentralized, self-governing system, a confederacy. But I don't have that. And the climate crisis is on us now. We have very little time to reduce carbon in the atmosphere to save ourselves from catastrophic global warming. And that means working with the government as it is today, unfortunately. I don't relish it, but I think it's necessary.
And I agree with you as far as realism goes. You have to work with the system you have. You have to work with the tools you have. You can constantly work to improve your tools and find better tools to get the job done. But until we do have a post-state society with anarchism, the government is there, and the government at worst will just get in the way of people trying to fix the problems.
Yeah. No, of course. I mean, you have to work. One of the advantages I have working now is that I know government. I know how people in government think, and they're not all bad people. I mean, I'm against the system. I'm not against the people within it. And I think government, in some ways, from my experience, brought out the worst in people, just as I think capitalism brings out the worst in people. And I would like a system, a social and governmental system, that brings out the best in people, our desire for solidarity, our desire to look after each other. But that doesn't mean I can't work with government at the moment. I'm looking at particular sectors of decarbonisation in my work. Government has more sway in those sectors than anybody else. That's just reality now. And so I've got to work to shift government. My long-term ideal, I continue to work for a different kind of society. I continue to write about it. I continue to talk about it. That's what I would fervently wish for. And I think it's possible, but it's a longer-term project.
Right, but you're actually approaching it from almost a point of experience, too. I mean, in the Accidental Anarchist, it shows you working with groups in northern Syria and Kurdistan where they've actually embraced anarchy, and anarchy works for them. And it's a proof of concept that it actually works. How did you find those people, and how did you like, what advice can you give people like here in New Hampshire, anarchists with the Free State Project, or people all over the world trying to embrace agorism and counter economics to live outside of the system? How have you seen it work?
Well, actual living anarchism has only happened in a few occasions in a few places in recent history. I mean,
Right.
Longer history, more ancient history, there's many examples of human societies organizing themselves along anarchist lines. But in the 20th century, the two biggest examples are the Spanish Civil War, the Republican areas of Spanish Civil War that were governed under anarchist principles, and most recently what's going on in what's called Rojava in northeast Syria, where the dominant philosophy is one of a kind of eco-anarchism, if you like. The ideas of an American philosopher called Murray Bookchin, who was read by a Kurdish leader called Abdullah Öcalan, and he encouraged his followers in a rather paradoxically top-down way to adopt this philosophy, which is basically bottom-up self-government, bottom-up government from the communal level, where everybody gets a say in government on an equal basis, regardless of ethnicity or gender. And one of the most striking things about that society is the prominent role of women, both in leading local society, but also in the military, where there are women-only units fighting ISIS, which have been highly successful. So it's a very striking example of anarchism in action, and what it shows is that it works. The criticism you get as an anarchist all the time is it's just completely impractical, it's utopian, it's just silly idealism, people are just not like that. And what Rojava and indeed Republican Spain showed is that it's possible. It happened, and it was real, and people like it. And when I began to hear about this, when we were preparing the film, I just thought I've got to go and see it for myself. I would hear about it, and I mean, inevitably, I was a bit suspicious that people were talking about it through rose-tinted spectacles and everything was tickety-boo, and I couldn't quite believe it in northeast Syria, of all places, that this was going on. So I felt I had to go and see it for myself, which was a revelatory experience.
And that's fascinating to hear. Like, I had never heard of it until watching your documentary, and that's something that, like, it jumps to me is we do have real world examples of people doing this now, today, and how to get it done. One of the things that stuck out to me in more recent years as an example of anarchism working hasn't even necessarily been societal anarchism, but political anarchism, with the Icelandic Pirate Party, and how they were formed and how they gained such traction in Europe and ended up becoming the third largest political party in the European Parliament, like seemingly overnight, just out of the blue. And when I read Swarmwise, Falkovich talks about it as a leaderless movement. That in order to gain traction, they just empowered people to make decisions on their own behalf and move forward. And that's something I've been trying to replicate within politics here locally in New Hampshire and in the United States with my work with the Libertarian Party, is saying, hey, we need to stop the top down. We need to stop telling people what to do. There is no grand plan. We need people to act in their own interests and on their own behalf and be empowered to do so. And I think political anarchy is just as important as social anarchy in that respect.
I think they're two sides of the same coin. I don't think you can have political anarchy without a social revolution and a revolution in attitudes. I think that bottom-up self-government, where everybody participates in decisions about their affairs, implies a change in our social relations. Not a difficult one, in my view, but a different one. I mean, we are taught to be suspicious of other people, to see them as competitors in the capitalist economy. We're taught not to trust them. The existence of government is premised on the belief that other people are not to be trusted, that people can't be trusted to govern their own affairs together. So I think the social change that has to come about at the same time is one about trusting other people, is one about adopting a culture of give and take and compromise, and above all, listening to other people. It's not just me, and my needs and my self-interest. I'm not that kind of anarchist. There are people who believe that kind of anarchism, who believe in the strong expression of one's own needs as being the driving force of society. I certainly believe in that kind of freedom, but I believe with it comes a responsibility to attend to the needs of others and to live harmoniously. We live with other people. We can't ignore their needs. And the kind of change in politics that you're talking about, which I thoroughly applaud, and I think is really plausible and doable, does, I think, come with it will come a social revolution in the way we treat each other. The more I look at anarchism, the more I see it as a change of social and personal responsibilities and philosophies as much as a change of political systems.
I'm to that point, it is cultural, and I think the belief that there is only one type of anarchy is fundamentally flawed, and it's a malignment against anarchist thought. It's a malignment against people who propose anarchy when there's it's chaos in the streets. You're preaching for chaos in the streets, no law and order, and selfishness. Whereas I do believe that there is something to be said about selfishness as a virtue, as Ayn Rand said. I'm not the biggest fan of the world of Ayn Rand, but I do think a lot of what she wrote does have merit. When taken in perspective of a non-hierarchical kind of anarchist society, like the motivations of the individual and selfishness. Well, to me, what makes my life best is a community that's operating harmoniously and working towards the greater good for everyone. It's more comfortable for me to live. So my own selfish virtue is to make my community better and take care of those around me.
Yeah. Look, I think we agree with that. I would probably describe it in different ways, but I think we agree on the ultimate end, and I think, and indeed the means to the end. I don't decry people who talk about selfishness as a motive. We're not angels. We are selfish. People are selfish. I'm selfish. I look out for myself in different contexts, but I believe that we can only flourish as individuals and be allowed to be selfish in that way in a society where other people are allowed to flourish at the same time. We can't. Our flourishing cannot come at the expense of other people's, and if it does, you don't have true anarchy. You don't have an equality of power. I mean, anarchy, at its heart, means equality of power. It means the abolition of hierarchy. It doesn't mean you can do whatever you want. And I think it is incumbent on us who believe these ideas to spell out in a bit more detail what they imply in terms of society, because we are struggling with very negative stereotypes about anarchism that we want, that we just want to chuck Molotov cocktails at the police. And
some do, but not everyone.
Tent camps in Seattle and whatnot. I think we have to talk about these positive examples of anarchism in action and talk about what it implies, because I think anarchism has a lot to offer people. It's very attractive as a political philosophy, and if people only knew what is on offer, I think we would get more interest and support.
I think one of the biggest problems we have with anarchists here in the United States and in the current political climate in the United States is kind of a divide on economic lines and a divide on like preferred economic system within their chosen anarchy. We have the political compass. It's a little meme that goes around every once in a year begging people to take a political quiz. Where do you land? Right, left, top, bottom? Are you libertarian on the bottom or authoritarian on the top? Are you socialist on the left or you free market capitalist on the right? And people try and figure out where they land. The reality is, like, the bottom two quadrants, the libertarian right and the libertarian left, are generally very anarchist. They're libertarian. They don't believe in authoritarian systems. They believe in non-hierarchical structures that benefit the individual and the collective rather than just a collective. But we don't see what I like to call bottom unity. We don't see anarchists aligning together to oppose authoritarian systems. We see anarchists who fall more on the right economically aligning with Republicans and conservative authoritarians to oppose the anarchists on the left who align with socialists and progressives on the left. And I don't know how we broach that, how we bridge that gap and bridge that divide between anarchists themselves to realize that the true enemy is not those who differ with you on economic preference, but those who differ with you on authoritarian hierarchical preference.
It's a really interesting point and quite a difficult conundrum. It is, I dare say, an American phenomenon. We don't really have a libertarian right in Britain or Europe. or a true libertarian right. We have a right, but it tends to be more authoritarian. It tends to believe in the power of government. It tends to believe in states and in a sort of top-down authority, providing a moral structure for people to behave within. We don't have that true anti-authoritarianism that you have as a political strain in the US. But I agree. I think there ought to be more common ground between the libertarian right and the libertarian left. I don't think they necessarily need to be opposed to one another, because we are talking about similar kinds of societies. And I think we need to respect the fact that we have those differences of view about how society should be governed, but we don't differ in our view about how that government should be structured and the fundamental principles of that government. And I think, I think one of the things that the anarchist left has trouble with is real diversity of views. I don't know if that's true on the libertarian right. I don't know the libertarian right very well, but the anarchist left has a problem with a real diversity of views. It can't accommodate, for instance, the libertarian right viewpoint. It finds it very difficult to accommodate that. And I think being a true anarchist is you have to face up to the fact that people think differently from you, and you have to find some accommodation with them. You have to find some way of working with them. And I think we ought to be doing that now rather than waiting for the political structures to develop.
Yeah, I think the real divide leans down to who you read. Like, we have people on the libertarian right who are just Rothbard, and they won't concede any point that Rothbard didn't make. And people on the left, it's Goldman, Kropotnik, Marx. Like, if it wasn't made by them, it doesn't exist. In reality, I don't know if you're familiar with Michael Malice. He is more of a libertarian right anarchist here in the U.S., very big, popular podcaster. And he published a book earlier this year called The Anarchist Handbook. It was just a collection of essays, but it was from all over the spectrum. He included Rothbard, he included Goldman, he included Kropotnik, he included Hayek, everyone across the board. And Jose Galison made a point where he said, you could take some of Emma Goldman's essays or some of Kropotnik's essays from that book and just replace the word socialist with capitalist, and most anarchists wouldn't know the difference.
Yeah, it's an interesting point. I'm very much from the anarchist left tradition. Emma Goldman and Fyodor Kropotkin are my heroes. I'm not a Marxian, though, and I think a lot of anarchist left would reject that, except as perhaps somebody who has something to contribute about a critique of capitalism, but certainly not the authoritarian consequences of that analysis, that we should have a totalitarian state to allocate resources amongst us. I don't think no true anarchist believes that. No, I mean, the Goldmans and the Kropotkins were clear about calling themselves libertarian socialists. That's what they called themselves. And I think that would be another label for the kind of anarchist I am. But I think there are enormous overlaps and similarities with the libertarian right, and that dialogue ought to be happening.
It's a struggle that we've been trying to make happen for years, at least within the Libertarian Party apparatus in the United States, because we do have a political party. It's the third largest party in the country, and it's accomplished nothing in 50 years because it's too busy fighting with itself rather than fighting the state.
Yeah, well, it's a kind of contradiction in terms of Libertarian Party, isn't it?
A little bit. And yes, well, in one of the founding principles of the Libertarian Party, you go back, they call it the Dallas Accord. At the first convention in Denver, when they formed the Libertarian Party, there was a big argument and a big disagreement amongst the delegates, which they settled a couple years later in Dallas with an accord where they agreed that the Libertarian Party, the political entity, would forever be agnostic on the existence of the state. It would welcome anarchists, it would welcome anarchists who could work together to reduce the state, but it would never take a position on whether or not the state should or should not exist.
Yeah, well, that's not libertarian, really, is it? I mean, anarchism, you can't accept the state and reject hierarchy. You can't have both. And I think this is one of the real difficulties for people on the left, is about the existence of the state, is about the sovereign entity, the idea of the Leviathan to keep control of us all. And it's very easy for certain right-wing strains of thought to slip into authoritarianism. And that's the paradox of libertarian right thinking, is that there's a very fine line between it and authoritarianism, that you want to have a strong state to enforce these freedoms, and to guarantee that people have that ability to follow their own instincts and desires. How do you protect that polity? How do you make that structure? And people are inevitably led towards the temptations of the state. And, the starting point for the anarchist left is the state is a bad thing. It's always a bad thing, except as a transitionary moment.
I don't think it's necessarily exclusive to the right, that problem. This is one of the problems I have with the right-left hierarchy, with the right-left paradigm, where we try and distill politics into a single plane and put it on, you're either on the right, you're on the left, how far on the right or how far on the left, because there's instances on the left, even within left libertarians that I'm familiar with and I engage with regularly, where their social progressivism is leaning more towards authoritarianism.
Yeah.
As much as people on the right are leaning towards authoritarianism for self-protection and selfish needs, people on the left are doing the same thing.
I agree. It's a habit we have to get out of. It's a really easy habit to fall into, that other people should basically be forced to adopt the policies that we think are right. And that's basically what the state does. It's a majoritarian system where we're all forced to accept the view of a putative majority. It never is the actual majority. It's always about, in your country, it's about 32% of the population who vote for a particular
on a good year.
And in my country, it's the same. And, the government supported between about 32 and about 38% of the adult population supports them. That's by no means a majority. But that in these systems, that majority has the right to enforce laws on everybody. And to me, that's intrinsically unfair. It's intrinsically divisive. It's something that we should be able to design better systems around. It's astonishing to me that in the 21st century, we're still stuck with these immensely crude models of republicanism, of the Republican state. And I think it's not beyond the man to design something that would be much better, that would be much more consensual, where we discuss our affairs together and try to reach agreement.
Yeah, I saw a meme circulating on Twitter yesterday that really starkly, it was a series of pictures side by side, and it said 1821, 2021. It was like transportation. It was a picture of a horse and buggy, and then a picture of a Lamborghini for 2021. Communication, it was somebody writing with a quill versus a cell phone on the right. It's like how much things have improved in 200 years, how technology has changed, how science has changed, how research has changed, people's understanding of the world has changed and improved in 200 years. And then the last one was a picture of Congress in 1821 and a picture of Congress in 2021. It was the same thing, just bigger.
Yeah. No, I think that's so right. That's so right. I mean, we are stuck with political systems that we've inherited. We haven't designed for the moment, and we're not even permitted to have a conversation about what would be a better design. Constitutional reform in the US is an absolute no-no. Heaven forbid, for God's sake, when you're at school, you have to swear your loyalty to this piece of paper. It's absolutely ludicrous. At least in Britain, we don't have to do that. We don't actually have a constitution. But, we have a similar utterly kind of artificial religious respect for the laws and precedent of our parliamentary system, which is ludicrous. We should be able to design something better.
I think the Pledge of Allegiance that you touch on there is one of the biggest highlights of hypocrisy and like the growth of accepting the state that we've seen from the authoritarian right, at least here in the United States, is like the history of that. The Pledge of Allegiance was written by a socialist. When he wrote it, he openly said it was a tool to instill compliance in school children and to basically brainwash people into blind acceptance and blind loyalty to the state.
Yeah.
And that glossed over, that history forgotten. Now it is the right, the anti-socialist, anti-communist right, that embraces and defends it as loyalty to this country's values. And so it was successful.
Yeah.
It was wildly successful at what it did. And to your point about like these are systems that we've inherited, that's social contract theory at its worst. Like people are saying like the taxes are the price you pay to live in a civilized society. But this is social contract theory. This is a system we inherited. This is a system we were born into that we had no option and no voice in its construction. And it's constructed in such a way that we have no voice in its reform.
We're never allowed to consent to it or negotiate it. We're just obliged to support it. From the day you're born, you're forced to go and register your children as citizens, and it's a criminal offense to not do so. We have no option but to accept this so-called contract. It's not a contract, it's an imposition, which I think is an eminently negotiable thing. And I think people would be so much happier if they could negotiate that contract. They may decide that they want a system that is very similar to the one we have today. Great, but at least they would have consented to it. And this way, there is no consent behind it. We're just forced to accept it.
And to me, that's one of the beauties of an anarchist system, is I could theorize. Again, we haven't seen it put into practice in the United States. There's so little evidence of it put in practice, other than the ones you've discovered for your documentary, is that in a truly anarchist system, absent government, that we could do, like, say we balkanize North America and it's more than 50 states, you devolve into localized communities. There could very much be a New York City as the capitalist banking economic center of the world, but in order for them to feed themselves, they're going to have to trade with the socialist communes in upstate New York that are growing the food and providing services to them. It's a matter of voluntary systems and voluntary interaction and consent-based economics to me. That would make the world go round. And it comes down to consent-based economics and consent-based interaction, where if you're unhappy with the system, you're free to leave and join another system.
Consent's the absolute heart of it. How many times are you given the opportunity to consent in the way that you're governed? At best once every couple of years. In our country, once every 5 years. It's pitiful in its rarity. But even then, you're not consenting to the system. You're actually legitimizing the system by participating in it. Which leads to the whole conundrum over whether or not you should vote to legitimize that system. It's a grotesquerie.
Yeah, and it comes down. There's always a big argument from anarchists on both sides, left anarchists, right anarchists, and libertarians. I always get the argument every 2 years during our biennial elections and every 4 years during the presidential elections, whether or not voting is even worth it, whether or not by voting, even if you're voting against whoever wins, are you consenting to the system by voting and participating? Like, at what point? And I try and tell them, it's like, even Hans Hermann Hoppe supported voting, even Ayn Rand supported voting. Every one of your anarcho-capitalist authors that you support supports voting in self-defense. At what point is voting consent to participate in the system? At what point can you opt out? Is there any point where you can opt out and revoke your consent in a meaningful manner? And if you can't revoke your consent in a meaningful manner, why wouldn't you engage in the processes that exist as a form of self-defense?
No, I think that's absolutely right. I mean, not voting in this circumstance is not a meaningful act. It's not going to have any significant impact on the system. If there was a larger movement to boycott a vote in order to send a signal to the system of its illegitimacy, then not voting would be a more plausible choice. But I think in the current system, you have no choice but to participate by voting for the least worst option of the politicians on offer. I think that's the conclusion people on the right have come to. It's certainly the conclusion people on the left have come to. It's certainly my conclusion. I don't think it makes sense. There are good and bad. There are worse and worse. There are bad and worse presidents. Sorry, what has happened to my English tonight? Sorry, it's not late. It's late here. There are bad and worse presidents, and you can take your pick between them. But I think it does make sense to choose. People have died for the right to vote, so I think it's a strange thing to give up without making that act impactful. Actually, have some effect. What I think needs to happen is, the sorts of ideas that we're talking about need to go mainstream. We need to get a bigger constituency behind them to start saying, and to, above all, start constructing alternative systems. The existing system is not going to give up its power easily. We're not gonna persuade it through logical argument. We're not gonna persuade it because our ideas speak to an ideal of humanity that people will flock to. I think we need to establish examples of how local self-government can work effectively, like in Rojava in northeast Syria. I think we actually need to start doing what we're speaking about, actually start implementing anarchist ideas at the local level. And perhaps that means organizing in your local workplace. Perhaps that means organizing in your local town, but establishing a forum which abides by the rules of participation that anarchism dictates, i.e. everybody has an equal voice. And we take enormous care to make sure that that is the case. Establishing a forum like that will have a legitimacy if enough people take part in it.
And to that point, here in New Hampshire, a byproduct of the Free State Project attempting to recruit 20,000 libertarians and anarchists to move to New Hampshire, and enough of them getting involved in the political process, we have about 40-50 state representatives. Granted, we have 400 total state representatives. It's the third largest parliamentary body in the world. The second largest English-speaking parliamentary body in the world is our tiny little state. But a solid 10 to 15% you can count on is to be at least minarchist libertarians leaning towards anarchy, and some who are outright anarchists, who are in the state legislature proposing legislation to reduce and eliminate state apparatuses and getting passed. We have a constitutional amendment to our state constitution being debated this year to secede from the United States. And that doesn't happen if anarchists don't get involved. And I like to tell people, agorism is great. I'm a huge fan of agorism. I engage in counter-economics myself. I do a lot of agorist business with friends and neighbors and members of my community that's not licensed or reported to the state. It's just service between friends and community members as a form of counter-economics and working outside the system. But no matter how much we want to pretend that the government doesn't exist and live our lives as if it doesn't exist, it doesn't make the boot on our necks lighter. It doesn't reduce the pressure that the government's putting on you. No, that's absolutely right. I think it's a difficult thing to ask people to do. I think what you're doing in New Hampshire is very interesting, and I need to learn more about it. But that would be the kind of thing I would talk about: infiltrating state institutions, starting to set up structures of self-government. I believe that we can, people will only be persuaded when they see anarchism in action. And that's not just in the way we govern ourselves. It's not just political institutions. It is also in the way we run social institutions, but also the economy. There are anarchist models of economics, of cooperative sharing of economic enterprise, so that everybody has a share in the enterprise to which they contribute. I think these are examples which are eminently plausible. There's no reason why we can't set those up now. And indeed, there are successful examples of cooperatives at scale in places like Spain and indeed Britain, and to an extent in the US. There's one or two in the US as well, which demonstrate the value of an anarchist approach to business. So I think it's doable, and that's what I would encourage people to do, is actually set up these things in practice, not just talk about anarchism as an ideal in the distant future. Well, as far as like anarchism in business, it's not quite anarchist. It's not a employee-owned enterprise, but like Morningstar Tomatoes out in California, they're the largest processor. They're the largest tomato processor in the world. I think the majority of all canned tomatoes in the world come through their processing plant. They're not necessarily worker-owned. They're not a cooperative. It's a private family-owned business, but they absolutely operate their business as anarchists, where they don't have a hierarchy. They don't have an employee hierarchy system within their business. Every employee, from the guy who works on the line, from the person running HR to the purchasing officer, is entitled to make with the same decision-making power. And every employee is very well compensated for their work, and like they have an open time off policy. Like if you need to leave to take care of your family, do it. That's prioritized over the business. If you think you can purchase a new piece of equipment that'll make your business unit more efficient, just go purchase it. We'll reimburse you. You don't need authorization. Everyone's entitled and authorized to make decisions on the behalf of the company. And they've done documentaries on Morningstar Tomatoes as being one of the most efficiently run organizations in the country and having the highest employee satisfaction when ranked and interviewed of anywhere else in the country when it's run on a non-hierarchical system.
Yeah. I mean, people love non-hierarchy. People love having autonomy. Where's the big secret in that? It's tragic that it's so rare. It's tragic that we have to talk about these examples as being so isolated. I work for a non-profit at the moment, which it's got all the usual BS about corporate life. We all listen to each other. We're a team. The boss attends to the opinions of the employees, but at the end of the day, somebody has power and somebody doesn't. At the end of the day, somebody has the power to fire the other people in the organization and deny them the means to live, which is quite a big deal. In America, getting fired means losing your healthcare privileges as well. It's huge power. I would say of Morningstar, who has the power to fire people? Because that's the ultimate power. If you still got that power resting in a few hands rather than spread out across the organization in a genuinely non-hierarchical way, it is not a non-hierarchy. It is a hierarchy. That's the bottom line.
Yeah, I certainly wouldn't call it a system absent hierarchy. It's definitely, I would call it more of just a flat or two-dimensional organizational structure where there's everyone working for the company and the owner of the company, as opposed to everything else, which again, some people like Hans Hermann Hoppe, who would defend anarchism as the best solution, would defend unilateral monarchy with a benevolent monarch as the most practical solution, as opposed to democracy. So I guess that's kind of a middle ground between where we are and what we want. Would be an absolute monarchy with a benevolent monarch. But the odds of getting a benevolent monarch one after another, Liechtenstein has had a great luck in getting Hans Harden II as their monarch, but who knows how his kids are going to be.
Exactly. I mean, a benevolent monarch is a contradiction in terms. I mean, when you have power out of your hands, you're not living in a benevolent society. Power is everything. Autonomy to live your life as you wish is everything. If you don't have that freedom, and if there is somebody constructing constraints around that freedom so that you don't have full autonomy, you're not a free individual. And that poison gets into your head. You're genuinely not autonomous. And that living in a monarchy or any kind of top-down sovereign system implies that. However nice the monarch is, however nice the sovereign is, however nice your president is, it's still not freedom. And I think that is ultimately a poison for the system, because ultimately you start to resent it. And I think that's what we've got in America and in Britain. You've got a populace who are deeply resentful of the political class and indeed the political system at some fundamental level. That resentment is very widespread, and it spreads across the political spectrum. Perhaps it's most pronounced on the right at the moment, but I think it's shared quite broadly, that people feel that political system is not something that they're really part of. The decisions are made about them without their participation. And that's a very ugly thing. That's a very bad thing. It's very bad for democracy. It's very bad for the future of our countries.
As much as people hate Donald Trump and hated the election of Donald Trump and thought that was the worst 4 years in American history, I think the very election of Donald Trump was a statement about people's greater frustration with the system as a whole.
Of course.
Because he represented a change. It was, as Jonathan Pye, one of my favorite British comedians and political commentators, commented, is like, Trump represented a change, a terrifying change, but a change nonetheless.
Yeah, a big finger to the system. That's what he was, ugly and vulgar as he was, and that's what he represented. And if you wanted to stick it to the system, that's how you voted. And that's how I see his election. I don't see it as a vote for his manifesto. He didn't really have a manifesto. He just said, I hate everything about Washington. And if you too hated everything about Washington, then you vote for him. That's what he exploited. I mean, he's the worst kind of authoritarian right-wing person, exploiting that disaffection with the political system. I would like to see that disaffection with the political system put to more constructive uses, put towards actual participation in political structures. That's how it should be resolved. It shouldn't be resolved by, a petty dictator emerging and telling us that he alone speaks for the little guy, speaks for the people. That's the trick that the likes of Trump are pulling.
Yeah, that's how Germany actually got Hitler.
Yeah, that's exactly how it got Hitler.
Now, you'd mentioned your nonprofit work, and that's something I did want to touch on. Like, your work with Independent Diplomat is something different and unique. I don't think anybody else is doing on a global stage, whereas you're kind of providing diplomatic services, a service the state would provide on its own behalf to people who don't have access to it. Like, how did you come up with the idea? Like, what possessed you to, like, I guess, working as a diplomat and understanding the need for that on the global scale? Like, how did you make the jump to making that available as an NGO and as a nonprofit?
Sure. Well, there were a couple of things. I mean, the first is I spent 4.5 years as a diplomat at the UN Security Council, which is a kind of cockpit of global diplomacy. It's a real center of diplomacy, discussing all the world's crises. And the one thing you could be sure of when you were discussing Iraq or Palestine or Syria or Myanmar was that the one group of people who would not be in the room were from Palestine or Iraq or Myanmar. Right. And I just felt that was wrong, and I felt that was stupid, because we needed their perspective if we were going to make decent decisions. But the big thing that brought it home to me was working in Kosovo, where I worked for the UN, which was run by a UN government, essentially, and where the Kosovo government, although it was democratically elected, was not allowed to participate in the process that was deciding the future of Kosovo, the so-called final status process. It was deciding whether Kosovo was going to be a state or not. And that I saw how that contributed to immense frustration on the ground that exploded into violence, into deadly violence on the ground. That political, it's analogous to what's happened in America, that political exclusion produces violence. And Kosovo had undoubtedly the legitimate right to be part of the international decision-making about its sovereign future. And so I was actually in Kosovo when I testified to that inquiry I mentioned earlier when I resigned. And Kosovo gave me the way forward. I quit the Foreign Office. I quit being an advisor in the UN. I flew home. And a couple of weeks later, I flew back from England, had dinner with the Kosovo Prime Minister, who I knew, and offered him my services and said, I can be your diplomatic advisor on this process. Can I help you? And we clicked a glass of rakia together, and that was that. And I became his advisor, and that was the first job that Independent Diplomat did, and that advisory role became the organization Independent Diplomat, which is doing it for all kinds of democratic groups and governments around the world.
And I think that's really fascinating, and it's something libertarians and anarchists have largely ignored as a necessity. And I think the problem with that is a lot of anarchist thought and a lot of anarchist philosophy is written before the information age. Yeah, you have people who were writing this and theorizing this and coming up with a philosophy who didn't live in an age of mass communication, who didn't live in an age where me in New Hampshire and you in London could be on a call, live stream to everyone on the internet to view and respond to, where information was so readily accessible and shareable, that we really do live in a globalized society now, where we live, even if we were to balkanize, even if we were to get rid of government, we live in a society where trade and interaction and business can be conducted across time zones and across continents very, very easily. And that necessitates a need for kind of coordination and management of those relationships. And doing so, founding an organization that does so privately, not as a government, that offers that service to help people embrace anarchy in the truest form of anarchy, conducting business and harmonizing your personal relationships without government, is fascinating. And it's something I didn't even think of as a necessity until I saw your work on it. And now I can't fathom an anarchist world without it.
That was nice of you to say so, Justin. I appreciate it. We've had I thought starting an NGO, just little old me, would be really difficult, and I get a lot of opposition to it. But actually, the idea in the world of diplomacy has been really well received. I mean, people in diplomacy really recognize that there's a need for democratic groups and governments to get help to conduct their diplomacy more effectively, that they have an absolute right to that. It's not fair that a little island state should go into the UN climate talks with nobody on its delegation who knows how to negotiate. That's not fair. And they should have those powers. They should have that capability, and Independent Diplomat gave them that capability. And that was a very exciting and powerful thing to do. It was a real privilege for me. I mean, I found it a real privilege working with small island states in the Pacific, or with the Frente Polisario of the Western Sahara, or with the Syrian Democratic Movement. It was immensely moving and powerful to be on their side in these fights. I found it much more exciting than working for the British government, for instance, even though I was working on incredible topics with the British government, whether it was Afghanistan or terrorism or the Israel-Palestine dispute. Really, really interesting work. But it was so much more powerful to be doing it on the side of the people on the other side of the table.
That's amazing. One other thing I wanted to touch on you with, and this is something, again, topical, again, something that the philosophers and writers of years past didn't really see coming as a roadblock to anarchy. We've seen a lot of notable anarchists, or notable right-leaning libertarian anarchists here in the U.S. in the past year recant their stances, recant their opinions, and say, COVID has proved that anarchy can't work. COVID has proved that you need a government to work on behalf of people and protect people. How do we deal with, in a truly modernized, globalized anarchist society, something like a mass pandemic?
Wow. Throw that at me right at the end. Just because you believe in anarchy doesn't mean you don't believe in institutions. I mean, I'm very skeptical of institutions. I think institutions can become very self-interested very quickly. But as long as those institutions are temporary and are spontaneously formed by people exercising their own will and consent, and are governed in a participatory way, then they can be legitimate. And that means you can have institutions that make decisions about difficult things like pandemics, collective decisions that people stick to. I think one of the problems that you've got in the US is that people are not sticking to the decisions of government because they don't see them as legitimate. They're not accepting vaccines or masks or whatever because they don't respect government in the US. They don't respect government's right to have that decision. And why do they not respect it? Because they feel government doesn't speak for them. They're not part of its decisions. If you had a government where people genuinely participated in its decisions, then I think that is a plausible vehicle to deal with something like the pandemic. Arguably, it's much better because people would consent to its decisions.
I personally think that, again, there is a lot of oppositional defiance to anything that the state would mandate. People don't like the idea of a mandate and the government telling them they have to do something. And I think there's a lot of people out there who would get vaccinated if it weren't for the state's mandate, if it weren't for the state telling them they had to do it. And I think we would say, I think there is a possibility for true spontaneous order in times of crisis if people are given information that is accurate, timely, and readily available. And I think the biggest problem we've had with this pandemic, with COVID-19 in the worldwide pandemic, has been access to timely and accurate information. Where even just last week, the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, is rolling out orders for mandates for third booster shots for vaccines. But the CDC just released their estimates that about 146 million Americans have contracted natural immunity through asymptomatic spread of the virus, and getting the vaccine won't actually improve their resilience to the future of COVID. Like, there is disputing information coming from two different government agencies that is causing people to just shut down and say, nope, I'm not listening to anything they have to say because they can't even agree.
Well, it's a really tricky one because, I think there's a certain strain of thought that thinks that government should decide things like vaccines, mandates, and all the rest of it. And certainly in a situation in Britain where the National Health Service enjoys a lot of popular support and is seen as a very legitimate institution, much more legitimate, arguably, than government or politics, certainly more legitimate than politics. It's like the most popular institution in Britain is the National Health Service. If the National Health Service is saying get vaccinated, then most people will. But there's also an argument, and the anarchist libertarian argument is that, your body is your last area of sovereign control. Your body should be sovereign. What you put into it, whether it's vaccines or whatnot, should be your choice. And I respect that view. I don't think you should be forced to put something into your body that you don't want. But I do think at the same time we should be respectful of credible scientific opinion, which does dictate that we should be getting vaccinated and wearing masks. I believe in science. I don't believe in government.
Well, I think, again, it comes down to credible scientific opinion. And a lot of the opposition to masks was rooted in the fact that the government changed its story 3 or 4 times early on in the pandemic. There was Fauci saying masks don't work, don't worry about them, you don't need masks, save them for first responders and people in medicine. And then, okay, now you have to wear a mask. It's like, but you just told me I didn't.
Yeah.
It
doesn't help, does it?
It doesn't help when the government is inconsistent.
No.
And if anything we've seen over the recorded history of humanity is that government is inconsistent.
Yeah.
All right. It's been a pleasure. This has been fascinating. I've loved having you on. Where can people follow you and learn more about your work?
Well, the best thing to do is follow me on Twitter, which is at Carne Ross, because I'm a regular on Twitter. I tweet usually several times a day, usually articles that I find interesting, some about the environment, some about anarchism, some about world affairs. So that's the best place to follow me. I'm afraid I'm not really keeping my Facebook page up to date. I'm not a big fan of Facebook for the
most anarchists
privacy reasons that people describe. I do have a website, which is an archive of my stuff, which is carneross.com. Thank you for putting that up.
Again, it's been fascinating. I'm going to send you some information about Liberty Forum coming up in New Hampshire in March.
Please. I'd be very interested.
Might be able to get out, or if it's something that interests you, we're going to have a bunch of libertarians and anarchists from all over the U.S. coming together for a big conference in New Hampshire.
I'd love to come. I love New Hampshire anyway. It's lovely.
Yeah, especially that time of year, right at the end of winter when everything's melting and it's beautiful. But until next time, everybody, thank you for listening. Thank you for watching, and do your best to be free. Thanks again for tuning in and joining us tonight. Make sure you hit that like button and leave a comment below to let us know your thoughts. If you haven't subscribed, go ahead and hit that big red subscribe button on YouTube and turn on notifications to get alerted every time we go live. If you enjoyed this content, you can join our production team on Patreon by following the link in the description. And don't forget to follow on social media and join our community Discord channel by following the links in the description as well. The best part of all of this is the community that we're building and growing. So go ahead and join us. And thanks once again to our awesome sponsors and patrons for making all of this possible. And if you can't catch the show live, you can always catch it the next day on YouTube, Odyssey, Anchor, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Breaker, and wherever else you listen to your favorite podcasts. So until next time, everybody, be free.